Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases in Appalachian history. Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It's always incredible to know we share these stories with people around the world. Today, we'll delve into events that took place over a century and a half ago at a time when West Virginia was still just a mountainous, isolated region of Virginia, where the silence of the forests held secrets that should never have come to light. It's the year 1859. Tensions between the North and South of the United States are growing daily. The Civil War is only 2 years away from tearing the country apart. But in the Appalachian Mountains, another kind of conflict is unfolding, far from the eyes of the big cities. Here on the oak and pine-covered slopes, where fog clings to the valleys like an icy blanket, entire families live isolated from one another by miles of winding trails. Law is a distant idea, something that belongs in the more civilized counties, not in these corners where each man dispenses his own justice. The region we now know as West Virginia was then part of Virginia, but it was always different. While the eastern plains thrived with plantations and slaves, the western mountains sheltered small farmers, hunters, and people who preferred the solitude of the heights to the company of men. Roads were rare and precarious. When it rained, they turned into rivers of mud that swallowed wagons whole. When it snowed, and it snowed heavily at these altitudes, communities were isolated for weeks. The only visitors were traveling peddlers, itinerant preachers, and occasionally outsiders seeking to escape their former lives. This was the landscape in which the residents of Greenbrier County lived, a vast expanse of mountainous land crisscrossed by icy streams and deep caves. Families had known each other for generations. Marriages took place between distant cousins because there wasn't much choice when your nearest neighbor lived a 3-hour walk away. Disputes were settled among men, often with fists or rifles, because the nearest sheriff was days away. And when something terrible happened, when something that defied all rational explanation emerged in those mountains, people preferred silence to truth. It was in mid-October of that year that the first reports began to circulate. October in the Appalachians is a time of transition. The leaves burst into hues of orange, red, and gold, creating a spectacle of beauty as nature prepares for the brutal winter ahead. But 1859 was different. That autumn arrived colder than usual. The first frosts appeared weeks earlier than expected, burning the last crops and leaving families worried about supplies for the dark months ahead. It was in this atmosphere of apprehension that a farmer named Elijah Harmon descended the mountain to the small village of Lewisburg, the county's administrative center. Elijah was known as a man of few words, as hard as the rocks that dotted his land. He raised a few pigs, grew corn on the less steep slopes, and hunted deer to supplement his family's diet. He was not a man to seek company or make unnecessary trips. When he appeared at the door of the local judge's house, his presence alone indicated that something was deeply wrong. Judge Thomas Caldwell was one of the few authority figures attempting to maintain some semblance of order in this wilderness. An educated man with a law degree from the University of Virginia, he had chosen to serve in the mountains because he believed every citizen deserved justice, no matter how far from civilization they lived. But even Caldwell, with all his experience handling land disputes, domestic violence cases, and the occasional murder of passion, was unprepared for what Elijah Harmon had to report. Sitting in the modest room that served as the judge's office, with a crackling fireplace, trying to ward off the chill that was already setting in, Elijah began to speak. His voice was low and controlled, but there was something in his eyes that disturbed Caldwell. It was fear, genuine fear from a man who faced black bears and mountain lions without flinching. Elijah explained that for the past 3 weeks, something had been happening in the mountains surrounding his property. Animals were disappearing. Not in the normal way, not like when wolves or other predators attack. They were simply vanishing, leaving behind only strange marks in the earth. But it wasn't the animals that had brought him here. That's what he'd seen 5 nights before. Elijah and his 2 oldest sons, Jacob and Samuel, 18 and 16 respectively, were checking the traps at dusk when they heard sounds coming from a nearby ravine. They weren't animal sounds. They were human voices, but distorted, as if several people were speaking at once in different tones. And there was a light, an orange light, pulsing through the trees, coming from an area where Elijah knew there was no house or camp. The 3 approached cautiously. What they saw, according to Elijah, defied explanation. A group of people gathered in a natural clearing between ancient rocks. They wore dark clothing, almost like cloaks, and formed a circle around something on the ground. The light came from torches, but also from something else, something that seemed to emanate from the very center of the circle. Elijah couldn't see clearly what it was, because at that moment his youngest son, Samuel, stepped on a dry twig. The crack echoed through the ravine like a gunshot. All the hooded figures turned at once. Elijah told the judge he would never forget that moment. He could see no faces beneath the hoods, only deep shadows where eyes and mouths should have been. And then a voice, deep and strange, said something he didn't understand. It wasn't English nor any language he knew. The three men ran. They ran like they'd never run before, tripping over roots, scratching themselves on thorny bushes until they reached the relative safety of their log home. They locked all the doors and windows. They loaded their rifles, and they waited out the night, listening to strange sounds echoing through the mountains until dawn. Judge Caldwell listened silently. He had known Elijah for years. He wasn't a man given to fantasies or drinking. If he was reporting this, he genuinely believed what he had seen. But what to do with such information? There was no law against strange gatherings in the mountains. No crime had been reported, just a disturbing story that could have dozens of explanations. Perhaps it was an unorthodox religious group. The mountains have always attracted sects and preachers who strayed from mainstream society. Perhaps they were immigrants with different customs. Or perhaps, and this Caldwell didn't say out loud, Elijah and his children had witnessed something best left alone. But the story wouldn't end there. For 3 days after Elijah Harmon's account, 2 children disappeared from a farm 8 miles away. And then the dark secrets of the Appalachians would begin to emerge from deep within the mountains, bringing with them truths that would forever change the way those people viewed the forests around them. The missing children were sisters, Marianne and Elizabeth Pritchard, 9 and 7 years old respectively, were the daughters of Robert and Catherine Pritchard, farmers who lived on a secluded property on the slopes of Mount Sewell, one of the region's most imposing peaks. The Pritchard family was known for its self-sufficiency and for its herd of goats, animals better suited to the steep terrain than ordinary cattle. Robert was a serious man of Scottish descent who held his family together with a firm hand and unwavering faith in divine providence. Catherine, his wife, came from a family established in the mountains for 3 generations and knew every trail, every spring, and every cave within miles. It was Catherine who first noticed the girls' disappearance. It was mid-afternoon on October 23rd, a cold Thursday with an overcast sky that threatened early snow. The girls had left shortly after lunch to gather dry firewood around the property, a common task they performed almost daily. They brought wicker baskets and the family dog, a large protective mongrel named Brutus. They were expected back in less than an hour. When 2 hours passed without a trace of them, Catherine began to worry. When 3 hours passed, panic set in. Robert gathered his 3 sons, all strapping teenagers accustomed to hard mountain work, and began the search. They followed the girls' usual path, calling their names repeatedly, hearing only the echo returning from the rocky slopes. They found the abandoned baskets near a grove of walnut trees about 500 miles from the house. The baskets were empty, lying on their sides in the damp earth. But there were no signs of a struggle, no footprints other than the small marks of the girls' shoes, and most disturbing, there was no sign of Brutus, the dog who would never leave them alone. The search stretched into the night. Neighbors were alerted, and even with the vast distances separating their properties, about 20 men gathered at dawn the next day to comb the mountains. They knew the dangers of that territory. Black bears were common, especially at that time of year when they prepared to hibernate and were particularly aggressive. Cougars, though rare, still inhabited the more remote areas. There were cliffs hidden by dense vegetation, deep ravines where someone could fall and never be found. And there were the caves, dozens of them, some mapped, many unknown, underground systems that stretched for miles beneath the mountains. For 3 full days, those men searched every accessible inch of the region. They divided into groups, explored old, rarely used trails, and descended into the most dangerous ravines tied with ropes. They shouted the girls' names until they were. They lit huge bonfires at night, hoping the light might guide the children back if they were lost and frightened. But they found nothing. No shreds of clothing torn from the bushes, no footprints other than those near the abandoned baskets, no sounds of children's cries echoing through the trees. It was as if Mary Ann and Elizabeth Pritchard had simply ceased to exist the moment they dropped their baskets. It was on the third day of searching that something changed. One of the men, an experienced hunter named Josiah Creek, was exploring alone in a densely forested area on the north side of Mount Sewell when he came across something that stopped him in his tracks. On the trunk of an ancient oak tree, about 10 feet above the ground, were marks. These weren't natural marks caused by animals or time. They were symbols deliberately carved into the bark. Josiah couldn't understand them, but he felt a chill run down his spine as he looked at the strange designs. Interlocking circles, lines intersecting at specific angles, and in the center something that vaguely resembled a human figure, but distorted with overly elongated limbs. Josiah mentally marked the spot and continued exploring in that direction. 500 wide ahead, he found another marked oak tree. The symbols were different, but maintained the same unsettling pattern. Another 500 wide, another marked tree. He was following a trail. He realized a trail marked not by footprints on the ground, but by signs in the trees, a trail that led ever deeper into the forest to areas even the bravest hunters rarely ventured. Josiah was a man of courage, but not recklessness. He knew that continuing alone would be foolish. He returned and reported his discovery to the others. There was heated debate among the men. Some wanted to immediately follow that trail of symbols. Others, more cautious, argued that they should seek help from the authorities. Robert Pritchard, consumed by the desperate need to find his daughters, insisted that they follow. His pain was palpable, a weight felt by all present. What father could sleep knowing there was a lead, any lead that had gone unfollowed? A group of 8 men, all armed with rifles and knives, decided to follow the signs. Josiah Creek led the way, using his tracking skills to keep the group on the correct trail. The markings continued, always on ancient oak trees, always at regular intervals. After 2 hours of difficult walking through increasingly dense vegetation, they reached an area none of them recognized. It was as if they had crossed into a different territory. The trees here were older, taller, their trunks so thick that 3 men holding hands could not embrace them. Sunlight barely penetrated the canopy of leaves overhead, creating a perpetual gloom even in the middle of the afternoon. And then they heard it, a low rhythmic sound, almost like chanting. It came from somewhere ahead, impossible to determine the exact distance because the sound echoed strangely among the giant trees. The men looked at each other. Fear was visible on their faces, but also determination. They were searching for 2 innocent girls. They couldn't turn back now. They advanced with extreme caution. Each step measured, rifles ready. The chanting grew louder, but no clearer. It wasn't English. It wasn't any language these men, some of German descent, others of Scottish and Irish, could recognize. They reached the edge of a circular clearing, and what they saw there on that cold October afternoon in 1859, deep in the unexplored Appalachian Mountains, would make many of them never sleep without nightmares. The clearing was perfectly circular, as if someone had deliberately removed all the trees, forming a perfect circle about 30 m in diameter. In the center was an unnatural stone structure clearly built by human hands. Stones were stacked in a low circle like a wall less than a meter high. And within this circle of stones there were people. They counted 12 figures all dressed in dark cloaks that covered their entire bodies. They were arranged in a circle facing the center and moved slowly as they sang that strange, disturbing melody. In the center of the stone circle was something covered in a dark cloth. The men couldn't clearly see what it was, but the shape suggested something the size of a reclining person, or perhaps 2 small people. Robert Pritchard's heart nearly stopped at the thought of this possibility. One of the men, more impetuous, stepped forward, stepping on a pile of dry leaves that cracked loudly like thunder in the heavy silence. Immediately the chanting ceased. The 12 figures stopped moving, and then in perfect unison, all the hooded heads turned toward the intruders. They shouldn't have been able to see through the thick cloaks covering their faces, but somehow they knew exactly where the men were hidden among the trees. What happened in the next few seconds would be debated and retold in various ways for years to come. Some of the men would swear that the hooded figures began to float above the ground. Others would say it was impossible, that fear and the darkness created illusions. But all would agree on one thing. They heard a voice deep and powerful, echoing through the clearing, coming not from any one direction, but from everywhere at once. And this voice said, in perfectly clear English, but heavy, with a strange accent none of them could place, "You should not have come here now. The price will be exacted from everyone." The terror that gripped those 8 men in that moment was visceral, primal, the kind of fear that awakened ancestral instincts that had lain dormant for generations. Robert Pritchard, even consumed by the desperate need to find his daughters, felt his legs tremble. Josiah Creek, a seasoned hunter who had faced bears and survived deadly blizzards, found himself unable to move. It was as if the air itself had become dense, heavy, pressing against their chests and making it difficult to breathe. But it was precisely in this moment of collective paralysis that something unexpected happened. Across the clearing, coming from the opposite direction from which the men had arrived, a figure appeared running. It was Brutus, the Pritchard family dog. The animal entered the clearing barking furiously with an intensity the men had never heard before. It wasn't the alert bark dogs use when they detect strangers. It was a sound of pure territorial aggression, the kind of sound an animal makes when protecting something precious against a mortal threat. The dog's sudden appearance broke the spell that seemed to have taken hold of the place. The hooded figures turned toward the animal, and for a brief moment their attention was drawn away from the men hidden in the trees. Robert Pritchard didn't think. He just acted. Driven by a fatherly love that overcame all fear, he ran from his hiding place toward the center of the clearing, rifle in hand, shouting his daughters' names. "Marianne, Elizabeth, father is here." His scream echoed across the mountains and seemed to break the other men's inertia. 3 of them followed immediately, their own protective instincts overcoming their terror. The other 4 stood at the edge of the clearing, rifles trained on the hooded figures, ready to fire if necessary. The ensuing confrontation was chaotic and confusing, a mix of rapid movement, screams, and a sense of unreality that would make the men question their own memories for days to come. The hooded figures dispersed. They didn't run normally, but moved with a strange fluidity, almost as if they were gliding over the ground rather than walking. They scattered across the clearing in different directions, and within seconds they disappeared among the ancient trees with a speed that seemed impossible, considering their long cloaks and the uneven terrain. It was as if the forest had simply swallowed them. Robert and the 3 men who followed him reached the circle of stones in the center of the clearing. There, on the dark cloth they had seen from afar, lay the wicker baskets, the same baskets Marianne and Elizabeth had taken to gather firewood 3 days earlier. They were empty and carefully placed side by side, as if placed there deliberately. But of the girls there was no sign. Robert dropped to his knees, picked up the baskets with trembling hands, and searched desperately for any sign of his daughters. There were only those baskets and the dark cloth beneath them. When Robert pulled back the cloth, he revealed what lay beneath. They were stones, dozens of them, carefully arranged in a different pattern. These were no ordinary mountain stones, but smooth river rocks, each about the size of a closed fist. They were arranged in 2 outlines, 2 silhouettes that clearly represented small bodies, bodies the size of children. Where each silhouette's head should have been, there was something different. They were dolls, rudimentary, made of straw and dark cloth, with human hair sewn onto the tops. Blonde hair the exact same shade as Marianne and Elizabeth's. The sight made Robert vomit. His companions were paralyzed by the horror of this discovery. They were practical men, accustomed to the harshness of mountain life. But this surpassed any experience they had ever had. There was a deliberateness to this arrangement, a message being conveyed through those macabre stones and dolls. But what message? And where were the real girls? Josiah Creek, regaining some composure, began to examine the clearing with a tracker's eye. He looked for footprints, for signs of recent passage, for any clues that might indicate where the hooded figures had taken the children, if they had any. But the ground of the clearing was strange. It appeared to have been swept or prepared in some way. There were no dry leaves accumulated, as would be natural at this time of year. The earth was evenly packed, as if many feet had trodden there repeatedly over a long period of time. At the edges where the clearing met the forest, he found tracks, but they were confusing, going in multiple directions, impossible to follow with certainty. The 8 men regrouped in the center of the clearing. They needed to make a decision. It was late afternoon, and in a few hours it would be completely dark. Navigating that dense, unfamiliar forest in the dark would be suicide. But the thought of abandoning the search, of returning without the girls, was unbearable for Robert. He implored the others to keep searching, to follow the trails marked in the trees, to search every inch of the area until they found his daughters. It was then that they heard the screams. They came from somewhere south of the clearing, piercing and high-pitched children's screams, screams of terror. All the men turned toward the sound, hearts racing, and began to run. Robert led the way, driven by an energy only a father's desperation can provide. They ran through the dense vegetation, leaping over fallen logs, dodging rocks, always following those screams that seemed to come from a little further ahead. Always a little further ahead. After 15 minutes of exhausting running, the screams abruptly stopped. The men stopped, panting, listening for any sound that might guide them. They were in an even denser part of the forest, where ancient trees formed a canopy, so dense it was almost like being inside a green cave. The remaining daylight barely penetrated, and then they realized something disturbing. They didn't recognize this place. Worse still, when they tried to orient themselves by the position of the sun, they found they couldn't determine which direction they had come from. Josiah tried to use his tracking skills to find his own footprints, but the forest floor was covered in a thick layer of moss that retained no clear marks. Every tree looked the same, gigantic trunks covered in lichen and vines. There were no distinguishing landmarks, no distinctive rocky outcroppings, no stream whose sound could guide them. It was as if they had entered a green maze from which there was no obvious exit. Panic began to set in among the men. They were experienced survivalists, but the situation was unlike anything they had ever known. They weren't simply lost. They felt deliberately disoriented, as if the forest itself were conspiring to keep them trapped. One of the men, a 22-year-old named Daniel Foster, began breathing rapidly, clear signs of a panic attack. His companions tried to calm him, but the truth was they all felt the same oppression growing in their chests. It was Robert who suggested they build a fire and wait until dawn. It was the wisest decision, though every fiber of his being screamed to keep searching for his daughters. But searching in the dark, lost in a hostile forest, would only result in more tragedy. They gathered dry wood, or as dry as they could find in the constant humidity, and Josiah managed to start a fire using flint and very dry twigs he carried in a leather pouch. The flames brought some comfort, both physical and psychological, creating a small circle of light and warmth against the growing darkness. They organized watch shifts. 2 men would stay awake while the others rested, rotating every 2 hours. No one really expected to sleep, but they needed to conserve energy for the next day. Robert sat by the fire, clutching his daughter's baskets to his chest, his eyes fixed on the dancing flames, silently praying for a miracle. The other men kept their rifles close, listening for any sound from the surrounding darkness. Nighttime in the Appalachian Mountains has always been filled with sounds. Owls hooting, small animals moving among the leaves, the wind whispering through the treetops. But that night was different. The silence was almost absolute, broken only by the crackling of the fire. There were no owl hooting, no sounds of nightlife. It was as if all the forest animals had fled, leaving this patch of mountain completely empty, and somehow that silence was more terrifying than any sound could be. The hours dragged by with excruciating slowness. The men around the fire remained tense, every muscle braced for the slightest sign of danger. The fire needed constant feeding, and each time someone got up to fetch more wood, the others watched anxiously until they returned to the circle of light. The darkness beyond the fire seemed solid, impenetrable, like a black wall surrounding them on all sides. It was during the second watch around midnight that something happened. Thomas Whittaker and Elias Green were on guard duty, while the other 6 men tried to rest, though sleep was practically impossible under the circumstances. Thomas was stoking the fire when he heard a sound that made his blood run cold. It was a voice, thin and distant, singing a childish melody, a lullaby every child in that region knew about birds and spring flowers. The voice was feminine, young, and came from somewhere in the darkness beyond the reach of the firelight. Thomas immediately nudged Elias, pointing in the direction of the sound. Elias heard it too, and his face palled. They quickly woke the others. Robert Pritchard recognized the voice instantly. It was Mary Ann, his eldest daughter. She was singing the song their mother used to sing to them to sleep. The recognition brought a simultaneous burst of hope and terror. His daughter was alive. She was nearby. But why was she singing alone in the darkness of that forest? Robert grabbed a makeshift torch, a thick branch with a burning tip, and began walking toward the voice. The other men followed, keeping close, rifles ready. The singing continued, always seeming to come from a little further ahead, drawing them deeper into the forest. After about 50 m of cautious walking, the voice stopped abruptly. The men found themselves in a small natural clearing, smaller than the previous one, surrounded by dense bushes. In the center of this clearing, illuminated by the flickering torch light, stood a doll. It was identical to the ones they had found in the stone circle earlier, made of straw and dark cloth with blonde hair sewn onto the top. It stood upright, leaning against a small stone, as if someone had carefully placed it there seconds before. But there was no one around, no sound of retreating footsteps, no sign of human presence beyond that sinister doll. Robert approached the doll with trembling hands. When he picked it up, he felt something strange inside. There was something sewn into the straw body. With fingers clumsy with urgency, he tore the cloth. From inside fell a piece of paper, old and yellowed, folded several times. With the help of Thomas's torchlight, Robert unfolded the paper. It was a page torn from a book, the edges ragged where it had been torn. The text was in English, but the handwriting was ancient, difficult to read in the dim dancing light. Josiah Creek, who had more formal education than most of the men present, picked up the paper and tried to decipher the words. It was an excerpt from some kind of diary or journal entry dated 1837, 22 years earlier. The entry described a ritual performed in the mountains, a gathering of people the diarist called the Guardians of the Deep. The text was fragmentary, missing sections where the page had been damaged by time, but it mentioned something about necessary payment and balance between worlds. The last legible line read, "Children understand what adults have forgotten, so only they can cross over." The words didn't make complete sense, but they carried a weight of omen that made all the men deeply uncomfortable. What ritual was this? Who were these guardians? And most frighteningly, what did "only they may cross" mean? Cross to where? Robert pocketed the paper, determined to show it to Judge Caldwell when they returned. If they returned, they decided to return to the main campfire. The experience of following the singing voice had been too unsettling, and everyone agreed they shouldn't stray again. They retraced their steps, following the marks they had left behind, and returned to their makeshift camp. The rest of the night passed without incident, though no one really slept. Each man was caught up in his own dark thoughts, trying to make sense of what they were experiencing. As the first light of morning began to filter through the tree canopy, a sense of relief washed over the group. Daylight, however dim in the dense forest, brought a sense of normalcy, of the possibility of orientation and escape. Josiah used the rising sun to determine the east, and from there he was able to calculate roughly where the circular clearing they had found the previous day was. From there, he hoped to retrace his path back to the familiar areas of the mountain. The return journey was long and exhausting. It took nearly 4 hours of walking before they finally recognized familiar landmarks. When they emerged from the dense forest and saw the Pritchard farm in the distance, it was almost noon. Catherine was in the yard, and upon seeing her husband and the other men returning, she ran to meet them. The hope in her eyes turned to despair when she realized the girls were not with them. Robert embraced his wife and told her everything that had happened. The words came out in a rush filled with raw emotion. Catherine listened in silence, tears streaming down her face, holding her husband as if he would disappear too if she let go. When Robert finished, she said something that sent shivers down everyone's spine. She too had heard the singing during the night, alone in the house, locked in with her youngest children. She had heard Marianne's voice singing that same lullaby coming from the direction of the forest. But Catherine was miles away from the forest where the men were camped. How could they have heard the same voice, at the same time in such distant places? News of what had happened spread quickly among families in the region. These 8 men recounted their experiences, and each story only deepened the fear that was beginning to creep into the mountain communities. Others began sharing their own stories, things they had seen or heard, but kept secret for fear of being considered crazy or superstitious. A farmer told of strange lights he saw dancing in the mountains on certain nights. An elderly woman spoke of voices coming from the caves near her property. Voices that seemed to call out the names of people long dead. Judge Caldwell, upon learning of the events, decided it was necessary to organize a larger, better-equipped expedition. He could not ignore the disappearance of 2 children, especially considering the bizarre circumstances reported by respected men in the community. He sent messengers to neighboring counties requesting help from authorities and experienced men. He also decided to formally document everything, creating official records that could serve as evidence should it be necessary to involve state authorities. Meanwhile, Robert and Catherine Pritchard lived in endless torment. Every hour that passed without news of their daughters was agony. They couldn't eat. They could barely sleep. The couple's other children, though strong teenagers, were visibly shaken. The house that had once been full of life and childish laughter was now plunged into a heavy silence, broken only by Catherine's occasional sobs and Robert's murmured prayers. On the 4th day after the disappearance, something extraordinary happened. It was early morning. The sun had barely risen when Brutus, the family dog, returned to the farm. The animal was exhausted, his fur covered in mud and small scratches, but alive. He went straight to Catherine, who was in the yard drawing water from the well, and began barking insistently. Then he ran a few meters toward the woods, looked back, and barked again. The behavior was clearly an attempt at communication to get Catherine to follow him. Robert was called immediately. He recognized the dog's behavior. The local sheep dogs were trained to guide people, and Brutus was clearly trying to lead them somewhere. Without hesitation, Robert grabbed his rifle and followed the animal. Catherine insisted on going along against her husband's protests. 2 of their older children also accompanied them. Brutus led them along a trail the family knew well, but then veered off in a direction they rarely explored, a steeply sloping area covered in a mix of pine and oak trees. After about 30 minutes of difficult walking, Brutus led them to the entrance of a cave. It wasn't large or particularly deep, as far as they could see from the entrance, but it was well hidden behind a natural curtain of vines and bushes. Someone could pass within a few meters without noticing it. The dog entered without hesitation, its silhouette disappearing into the darkness. Robert lit an oil lamp he had brought and followed the animal inside. Catherine and her 2 children followed. The cave was larger than it appeared from the entrance. The low ceiling forced the adults to walk hunched over, and the humidity was so intense that their breath formed clouds of steam in the cold air. The light from the oil lantern created dancing shadows on the jagged rock walls, revealing limestone formations that constantly dripped. The sound of dripping water echoed throughout the cave, creating a natural hypnotic melody that seemed to come from all directions at once. Brutus continued forward confidently, clearly familiar with the path. The family followed, hearts racing, unsure of what they would find deep within the mountain. After about 50 m, the passage widened, and they entered a larger natural chamber. Robert's flashlight revealed something that made them stop in their tracks. There were clear signs of recent human occupation, a dead fire in the center of the chamber, ashes still visible. Stones arranged to form rudimentary seating around the fire, and in the far corner, old blankets were piled high, as if someone had slept there. Catherine went to the blankets and examined them with trembling hands. They were homespun, the kind any family in the region might have made. But tucked into one of the folds of the fabric, she found something that made her gasp. It was a small piece of blue ribbon, the kind used to tie back hair. Catherine recognized it immediately as a ribbon she had sewn herself and given to Elizabeth weeks before. Her daughters had been in that cave, or at least one of them had. Robert examined the camera more carefully, searching for other clues. He found markings on the walls, some of the same symbols they had seen carved into the trees in the forest. Here, however, they seemed older, worn by time and moisture. There was also what appeared to be writing, but in a language he didn't recognize, letters formed strangely, almost like runes. He tried to copy some of the symbols onto a piece of paper he carried, thinking perhaps someone more educated could decipher them. Brutus hadn't stopped in the first chamber. The dog continued down a smaller, narrower side passage. Robert hesitated for a moment, considering whether it was safe to continue, but the presence of Elizabeth's ribbon eliminated any doubt. Wherever this cave led, his daughters had passed through. He had to follow it to the end. The family continued, now in single file, because the passage was too narrow for them to walk side by side. The tunnel descended at a gradual angle, taking them deeper and deeper into the mountain's bowels. The temperature dropped noticeably with every meter they advanced. The air became thinner, harder to breathe, laden with a mineral odor reminiscent of rusted metal. After what seemed like endless minutes of claustrophobic walking, the tunnel opened into a second chamber, this one much larger than the first. The sight that greeted them there was both wondrous and disturbing. The chamber was vast, its high ceiling disappearing into darkness beyond the reach of the lantern's light. Massive stalactites hung like the teeth of some gigantic creature, and matching stalagmites grew from the floor, some already meeting to form natural columns. But most impressive was the underground lake that occupied half the chamber. Its waters were a deep, crystal-clear blue, so clear that they could see the rocky bottom several meters below the surface. The water glowed with a soft luminescence, a light of its own that came not from Robert's lantern, but from something within the lake itself. Catherine approached the lake shore and gazed at the shimmering waters with a mixture of fascination and fear. There was something profoundly unnatural about that luminescence. No underground lake should glow on its own, yet at the same time the beauty was undeniable, almost hypnotic. She reached out to touch the water, but Robert caught her wrist before her fingers touched the surface. Something in her, some primal instinct, screamed that this water should not be touched. Brutus, however, didn't share the same reservations. The dog had run around the lake and was now barking insistently from the other side, near an opening in the rock wall that led to another passage. It was clear he wanted them to keep going. Robert led the family around the lake, keeping a careful distance from the shimmering waters. As they walked, he noticed something disturbing. There were objects at the bottom of the lake. He couldn't clearly make out what they were due to the depth and distortion of the water, but he saw shapes that looked like tools, perhaps weapons, and something that looked disturbingly like bones. The third passage was even narrower than the last, forcing them to practically crawl in some sections. The family considered turning back, especially when one of the sons, 16-year-old James, began showing signs of panic from claustrophobia. But they were so far gone already, so deep, that returning without answers seemed unthinkable. Catherine encouraged James, reminding him that his sisters needed them, and the young man found the courage to continue. Finally, after another 15 minutes of struggling through the narrow passage, they emerged into a third chamber. This one was smaller than the last, more intimate, but it had something the others lacked. Natural light streamed in through cracks in the cave ceiling, thin shafts of sunlight creating luminous patterns on the stone floor, and in those shafts of light, clearly visible, was further evidence of their daughter's presence. There were 2 small leather shoes, the kind children wore, carefully placed side by side in the center of the chamber. Catherine ran to them and picked them up with trembling hands. They were Marianne and Elizabeth's shoes without a doubt. She recognized every patch, every mark of wear, but the girls were gone. The chamber was empty except for the shoes and a few strange symbols on the walls. Robert examined the walls more closely. The symbols here were different from the previous ones, more elaborate, forming patterns that almost seemed to tell a story. There were figures that could have been people, some standing, some kneeling. There were shapes that suggested mountains, trees, and something that could have been the sun or the moon. And in the center of it all, there was a symbol larger than the others, a circle with lines radiating from it, and within the circle something that vaguely resembled a door. It was then that Catherine noticed something she had initially overlooked. One of the cracks in the ceiling was larger than the others, wide enough for a thin person to squeeze through, and there were marks on the walls below it, marks that suggested someone had climbed recently. Hanging roots offered something to hold on to, and the rock had natural indentations that could serve as footholds. It was possible, though dangerous, to climb to that opening. Robert immediately understood what his wife was thinking. His daughters could have left the cave that way, or someone could have taken them that way. Without hesitation, he began climbing. It was difficult, his hands slipping on the damp roots, but determination drove him. After a tense climb of about 20 feet, he reached the opening and pulled himself out. He emerged into an area of the forest he didn't initially recognize. It was on a steep slope covered in dense vegetation. It took him a few minutes to orient himself using the sun, which was now high in the sky, indicating it was mid-afternoon. When he finally recognized some distant landmarks, he realized with a shock where he was. The cave had led them through the mountain. They had traversed miles of solid rock and emerged on the other side in an area that would normally take hours of difficult walking to reach from the surface. Robert helped Catherine and the children upstairs. Once everyone was out, they looked around for any sign of where Marianne and Elizabeth might have gone. Brutus, who had climbed with them, immediately began sniffing the ground, moving in ever-widening circles. Suddenly, the dog stopped, fixed its gaze in a specific direction, and began running downhill. The family followed as quickly as they could over the uneven terrain. Brutus led them through a particularly dense patch of rhododendrons, shrubs with large leaves that formed almost a natural tunnel. When they emerged on the other side, they found themselves in a small clearing that housed something completely unexpected. It was a small rustic cabin built of irregular logs and a bark roof. Smoke rose from a makeshift chimney, indicating a fire was burning inside, that someone was home. Robert approached the cabin with extreme caution, his rifle gripped tightly in his hands. Catherine and the children remained a few steps behind, tense and alert. Brutus had stopped barking and was now growling low, a guttural sound that indicated both aggression and uncertainty. The cabin was primitive, crudely built, but there was something about it that suggested long-term occupancy. There was a neat stack of firewood by the door, tools hanging on the outside wall, and a small vegetable garden growing in the back. Before Robert could decide whether to knock or simply open the door, it moved of its own accord. It swung open slowly, creaking on its makeshift leather hinges, and there, standing in the doorway, stood a woman who seemed to have stepped out of another time. She was elderly. Her exact age was impossible to determine, but she was certainly over 70. Her face was deeply wrinkled, scarred by decades of exposure to the sun and mountain wind. Her hair was completely white long and tied in a loose bun. She wore simple clothes, a style that had been fashionable decades ago, patched so many times it was difficult to tell what the original fabric had been. But most striking were her eyes. They were a light, almost silvery gray, and they stared directly at Robert with an intensity that made him involuntarily take a step back. There was no fear in those eyes, no surprise. It was as if she had been waiting for them, as if her arrival was something foreseen and inevitable. When she spoke, her voice was husky, but firm, carrying an accent Robert couldn't quite place, though it had hints of German or perhaps Dutch. "You came for the girls," she said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. You knew they would come. The paths always lead those who need to find them to where they need to be. Her words were strange, unusually phrased, but perfectly understandable. Catherine stepped forward, overcoming her fear with a desperate mother's need. "Our daughters, Marianne and Elizabeth Pritchard. Where are they? Are they here?" The elderly woman shook her head slowly, a movement that conveyed both denial and something deeper, more complex. "The girls came through here." "Yes. 3 nights ago, they came through the cave just like you. They were scared, lost, but not hurt. I gave them food, water, a place to rest. I tried to explain, but they were too young to fully understand." She paused, her silver eyes scanning each member of the Pritchard family. "They are no longer here. They were taken to where they needed to be." Robert felt anger rise in his chest. Taken by whom, to where? His voice trembled with the intensity of his emotions. The woman did not flinch in the face of his fury, remaining firm and calm by the guardians to the other side. "It is the ancient path practiced in these mountains long before your ancestors crossed the ocean, long before the English, the French, the Spanish set foot on this land. The original people of these mountains knew the places where worlds touch, where the veil between what you see and what you cannot see becomes thin enough to pass through." Her words sounded like delirium, like the ramblings of a mind troubled by loneliness and age. Catherine began to cry, feeling they had come so close only to find nothing but a crazy old woman spouting nonsense. But Robert, despite his anger and despair, noticed something. The woman spoke too specifically, too detailedly for it to be mere fantasy, and there was something in her eyes, a clarity that belied the apparent insanity of her words. "Explain," Robert said, forcing himself to speak calmly. "Explain so we can understand. What are these guardians? What other side? And how do we get our daughters back?" The woman sighed deeply and gestured for them to enter the cabin. "It's a long story and best told sitting down. Come, I promise there is no danger here. There are only ancient truths that few still remember." They hesitated for a moment, but curiosity and desperation overcame their fear. They entered the cabin, which was surprisingly tidy and clean inside. There was a simple bed in the corner, a rustic wooden table with 2 chairs, and shelves filled with glass jars containing dried herbs and liquids of various colors. In the center was a fireplace where a small fire crackled merrily. The woman invited them to sit, and although there weren't enough chairs for everyone, they made themselves comfortable as best they could. She began her story. She said her name was Greta, the name her parents had given her when she was born in 1783, 76 years ago. She had arrived in these mountains as a child, brought by her parents fleeing religious persecution in Pennsylvania. Her family belonged to a group that preserved ancient knowledge, traditions dating back to medieval Europe and beyond, blended with wisdom learned from the native peoples who inhabited the mountains long before the arrival of colonists. According to Greta, there were special places in these mountains, places where the barrier between the physical world and another plane of existence became permeable. Ancient peoples called these places by different names. Some spoke of portals to the spirit world. Others spoke of passages to subterranean realms where beings who never saw the light of day lived, but all agreed that these places were sacred, powerful, and dangerous to those who didn't understand their rules. The guardians, she explained, were people who had dedicated their lives to protecting these places and maintaining the necessary balance between the worlds. They weren't necessarily evil, but they followed ancient laws that didn't make sense according to the Christian morality the colonizers had brought. These laws required offerings, specific rituals performed on set dates, and occasionally what she called the crossing of certain people from one world to another. Catherine was growing increasingly agitated by this story that sounded like something out of a macabre fairy tale. "Are you saying our daughters were taken to some other world, that they were sacrificed in some pagan ritual?" Her voice was filled with horror and disbelief. Greta shook her head firmly. "Not sacrificed. That would be against all laws. There is no death in the crossing, only transformation, a change of place. The girls are alive, but no longer on this side. They were chosen because children have the necessary purity, the innocence that allows them to see and cross without being corrupted by adult skepticism." Robert slammed his fist on the table, making the vials on the shelves rattle. "This is madness. Where are my real daughters? What kind of insane cult is operating in these mountains?" Greta remained calm in the face of the angry outburst. "I am not your enemy, Mr. Pritchard. I did not take your daughters. I have simply lived long enough to know truths that others have forgotten or chosen to ignore. If you do not believe my words, believe your own experiences. You saw the symbols. You found the clearing. You heard the voices. You traversed an entire mountain through caves that seemed to guide you. Do you think all this is coincidence?" Her words brought a heavy silence to the cabin because she was right. They had experienced things that couldn't be easily explained. Marianne's voice singing in 2 places at once. The dolls with real hair, the underground lake that glowed with its own light, the repeated symbols on trees and caves, Brutus guiding them along an impossible path to that remote cabin. Everything seemed connected by an invisible thread that Robert couldn't completely deny, no matter how much his rational mind screamed that it was impossible. "If what you say is true," Robert began slowly, choosing each word carefully, "then there must be a way to bring our daughters back. If they were taken through some kind of portal or passage, there must be a way to reverse it." Greta looked at him with something that might have been pity or perhaps respect. "There is a way, but it is dangerous and requires sacrifice. The guardians will not return the girls without receiving something in return. It is the law of balance. Something given, something received, something taken, something returned, but the price may be higher than they are willing to pay." Catherine knelt before the old woman, tears streaming freely down her face. "Any price, any sacrifice. These are our daughters, our babies. I will do whatever it takes. I will go wherever I need to. Just tell me how to bring them back." Greta placed a wrinkled hand on Catherine's head, an almost maternal gesture. "The next opening will be in 2 nights, when the moon is at its darkest. That is when the veil is thinnest, when crossings are possible, but you must be prepared. The place is sacred and tolerates no disrespect. The rules must be followed precisely, or you will lose more than your daughters. You may lose yourselves." The next 2 nights were the longest the Pritchard family had ever experienced. Greta accommodated them in her cabin, insisting they stay close until the opening. The space was cramped for so many people, but no one complained. There was something comforting about the old woman's presence, despite the disturbing nature of her revelations. She prepared simple but nourishing meals using herbs and roots she gathered from the surrounding forest, combined with vegetables from her small garden. During those days, Greta taught the Pritchard family things they had never imagined existed. He showed them plants that grew only in specific places in the mountains, places where the energy was different, where animals behaved strangely, and compasses spun aimlessly. He explained that the symbols they had seen were an ancient language, not meant to be read with the eyes, but felt with something deeper. Each symbol carried an intention, a vibration that affected those who gazed upon it. Robert, ever skeptical, constantly asked questions, trying to find flaws in Greta's logic, seeking rational explanations for what she described. But the old woman answered each question with infinite patience, sometimes with stories, sometimes with practical demonstrations. She led him to a nearby clearing where 3 trees formed a perfect triangle. In the center of this triangle, the air seemed to vibrate visibly like heat waves on a summer afternoon, except the day was cool. When Robert reached out into that space, he felt a resistance as if pushing against invisible water. Catherine, for her part, absorbed every word Greta said with a mixture of hope and terror. As a mother, she was willing to believe in anything that could bring her daughters back, but as someone raised in traditional Christianity, it all profoundly challenged her beliefs. Greta sensed her inner conflict, and one afternoon, as they prepared roots for the meal, gently spoke to her about it. "Your faith is not in conflict with what I'm going to show you. The divine has many faces, many expressions. What you call God is too vast to be contained in a single interpretation. These mountains know the sacred in ways that stone churches never will." On the morning of the 2nd day, Greta began preparing them specifically for the ritual that would take place that night. She explained that only 2 of them could make the crossing, accompany her to the place where the veil was thinnest, and attempt to negotiate with the guardians. Taking more people would be dangerous and could unbalance the necessary energies. Robert and Catherine naturally would be chosen. The couple's 3 children would remain in the hut, waiting and praying for everyone's safe return. Greta instructed the couple on what they should and shouldn't do. They couldn't speak unless directly asked. They couldn't touch anything they saw, no matter how tempting or familiar it seemed. They were to keep their thoughts focused solely on their daughters, visualizing their faces, remembering their voices, keeping alive the loving connection that united them. Any distraction, any fear they allowed to dominate their minds could result in them being trapped on the other side, or worse, attracting the attention of entities that should not be disturbed. The old woman also gave them objects to carry. For Robert, a small leather bag containing earth taken from the very spot where his daughters had been born on the Pritchard farm. Greta had sent one of the couple's sons back to the property specifically to collect this earth, explaining that it would be an anchor, a physical connection to the world where Marianne and Elizabeth truly belonged. For Catherine, a silver locket containing locks of the 2 girls' hair, cut as babies, and kept by Catherine as a memento. This locket would serve as identification, proof to the guardians that they were not trying to rescue strangers, but their own daughters. As the day wore on, a growing tension gripped the cabin. The couple's sons, James, Samuel, and the youngest 13-year-old David, struggled to maintain their courage. But fear was evident in their young eyes. They were about to be separated from their parents in a nightmare, with no guarantee they would ever see them again. Robert gathered the 3 boys together and spoke to them as he had never spoken to them before, not as the authoritarian father he had always been, but as a man confronting his own mortality and the limits of his understanding of the world. "If we don't return," he said, his voice choked with emotion, "I want you to know that everything we did was out of love. For your sisters, for you, for our family. Don't be afraid to live your lives fully. Care for the land, care for each other, and always remember that in these mountains there are more mysteries than we will ever understand. Respect that. Don't try to understand everything. Just live with courage and kindness." The three young men embraced their father, tears streaming down faces hardened by work in the mountains. Catherine in turn held each child as if for the last time, whispering blessings and words of love. As the sun began to set, dyeing the sky in oranges and purples that seemed particularly intense that afternoon, Greta declared it was time. She prepared herself, changing out of her everyday clothes for a long, dark, almost black dress made of a fabric that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Around her shoulders she draped a shawl embroidered with the same symbols they had seen on the trees and caves. She lit a special torch unlike the ordinary pine torches. This one had been prepared with specific woods and herbs that when burned produced a greenish flame that illuminated without blinding, revealing without completely exposing. The three of them left the cabin as the last light of day faded over the horizon. Brutus tried to follow, but Greta firmly ordered him to stay, and the dog, after a moment's hesitation, obeyed, lying down at James's feet with a low whimper of sorrow. The journey began down the mountain, but not along the path they had used to arrive. Greta led them along a different, less obvious trail, winding between strange rock formations and twisted trees that seemed to have grown in impossible ways, their trunks spiraling as if twisted by giant hands. As they walked, the forest around them began to change, not dramatically but subtly. The trees seemed older, their trunks covered in moss that glowed faintly in the growing darkness. The normal nighttime sounds, crickets chirping, leaves rustling in the wind, the distant hooting of owls were all absent. There was only the sound of their own footsteps and breathing. The air grew colder by the minute. Not the normal chill of an October night, but a chill that seemed to come from deep within the bones, making their teeth chatter, not from temperature, but from something more primordial. After about an hour of walking, they reached a narrow valley between two rocky outcrops. Greta stopped and gestured for Robert and Catherine to be completely silent. He pointed ahead, where the green torch revealed the entrance to another cave, but this one was unlike any they had seen. The opening was perfectly circular, so perfectly that it could not be natural. The surrounding rock was covered with deeply carved symbols, not just the simple symbols they had seen before, but complex patterns that seemed to move and change in the dancing light of the torch. "We now pass into a place that exists between places," Greta whispered, her voice barely audible. "When you enter, you may see familiar things. You may hear voices of people you know. Ignore everything. Follow only my light. Keep your hands on the objects I have given you. And no matter what happens, no matter what you see or hear, do not let go of my hands when I ask you to hold them." With these final terrifying instructions, she entered the circular cave. Robert and Catherine looked at each other for a brief moment, finding strength in each other's eyes, and then followed her into the darkness that awaited them. The interior of the cave was impossible. There was no other word to describe it. The tunnels curved at angles that shouldn't exist in three-dimensional space. Gravity seemed to work differently because at times Robert felt like he was walking on walls or even the ceiling. Greta's green torch was the only constant, a point of light they desperately followed as reality around them seemed to bend and distort. They began to see things in the shadows, figures that could have been people or animals or something else entirely. They heard whispers in unknown languages, children's laughter echoing in impossible ways, and occasionally the sound of their own voices calling to each other from directions where they knew no one was present. Catherine clutched the medallion in her hand so tightly her nails cut into her palm. Using the physical pain to ground herself, to remind herself that she was real, that she had a purpose, that her daughters needed her. Robert murmured prayers under his breath, not the formal prayers he'd learned in church, but words that came straight from his heart, desperate pleas to whatever power might be listening. And Greta continued forward with firm, sure steps, as if she'd made this journey 1,000 times before, as if she knew exactly where she was going, even when everything around her seemed like formless chaos. After what felt like an eternity, but could have been mere minutes, the tunnel opened into a chamber that defied all comprehension. It was vast beyond measure, so large that Greta's torch couldn't illuminate the walls or ceiling. But there was light coming from elsewhere, a diffuse luminescence that seemed to emanate from the air itself, creating a perpetual twilight where shadows and light mingled in ways that shouldn't have been possible. The floor was smooth as glass, but as they stepped, ripples of light spread from their feet, as if they were walking on solidified water. In the center of the chamber stood a structure. It wasn't quite a building, nor quite a natural formation. It was something in between, as if rock and architecture had fused through millennia of focused intention. Columns rose in a circle, but they didn't follow straight lines. They curved and intertwined with one another like ancient trees. Between these columns was what could only be described as a curtain of light, translucent, undulating gently even though there was no wind. And through this curtain, figures could be seen, distorted and blurred, moving in patterns that suggested dance or ritual. Greta stopped a distance from the structure and gestured for Robert and Catherine to stand on either side of her. "Now," she whispered urgently, "hold my hands, and no matter what, do not let go until I tell you. The guardians will come. Do not speak unless asked directly. When asked what you seek, tell only the simple truth. Nothing more." She held out her wrinkled hands and the couple took them, immediately feeling a strange sensation, as if an energy circuit had been completed between them. Greta began to speak not in English, but in a language that flowed like water over stone, full of guttural sibilant sounds that made the air around them vibrate visibly. Her voice echoed through the impossible chamber, multiplying until it seemed as if dozens of Gretas were speaking in unison. The figures behind the curtain of light stopped moving for a long moment. Nothing happened. The silence was absolute, oppressive, pressing against the couple's eardrums as if they were underwater. Then the curtain of light began to dissipate, not disappearing completely, but becoming transparent enough for them to see what lay beyond. 7 figures stood in a semicircle. They wore cloaks similar to those they had seen in the first clearing, but these were more elaborate, embroidered with threads that seemed to capture and reflect light in impossible ways. Their faces were still hidden beneath deep hoods, but there was a presence emanating from them, a sense of age and power that made Robert and Catherine want to fall to their knees. One of the figures, the one in the center, stepped forward. When he spoke, his voice was strangely androgynous, making it impossible to determine whether he was male or female, young or old, but the words were in English, perfectly clear, though they carried an accent that belonged to no known region. "Cleft of the eastern mountains, bring mortals to the crossing place. You know the laws, you know the price. Why do you bring these two?" Greta responded firmly, also in English this time, "I bring Robert and Catherine Pritchard, parents of the children Marianne and Elizabeth Pritchard, who crossed over 3 moon cycles ago. They come to claim their daughters through the ancient laws of family reclamation." The central figure remained still for a moment, then inclined his head slightly. The children crossed over voluntarily, guided but not forced. They saw the path because their hearts were pure enough to see. They were accepted on the other side, and now reside where time and pain cannot reach. Why should we return them to the world of suffering? Catherine felt tears burn her eyes, but forced herself to remain silent, remembering Greta's instructions. It was Robert who answered, his voice trembling but determined. "Because they are our daughters, because we love them more than our own lives, because they belong to our world, to our family, to the life we have built for them. No matter how beautiful their place is, it is not where they should be. They are children. They need to grow, to live, to experience all that life has to offer, even suffering, because that is part of being human." There was a murmur among the 7 figures, a sound like wind through dry leaves. The central figure spoke again. "Fatherly love, the oldest bond of all we understand. But understanding is not enough. The laws demand balance, something given for something received. 2 souls have crossed from your world to this one. 2 souls must return, but 2 must stay in their place. This is the law that cannot be broken, for it maintains the separation between the worlds." The meaning of these words struck Robert and Catherine like a physical blow. They were saying that to rescue their daughters, two of them would have to stay behind. It meant choosing between their children or choosing between their children and themselves. Catherine sobbed audibly, and Robert felt his legs weaken. How could they make such a choice? How could any father? It was Greta who spoke, her voice carrying decades of accumulated wisdom. Guardians, you know the laws better than anyone, but you also know the exceptions. The price need not always be paid in flesh and soul. There are other forms of balance, other offerings that can satisfy the need for exchange. The figures fell silent, as if considering or perhaps consulting among themselves in ways that could not be perceived. Finally, the central figure responded, "Speak, elder, what offering do you propose?" Greta released Robert and Catherine's hands and stepped forward. From the shawl she wore, she withdrew an object neither of them had seen before. It was a crystal about the size of a hen's egg, pulsing with an inner light in hues of blue and violet. "I offer the dreamstone guarded by my family for 7 generations, brought from the old world when my ancestors crossed the Great Sea. It contains memories of 1,000 years, knowledge of ancient practices, secrets that would be lost when I die. It is worth more than 2 mortal lives, for it contains fragments of countless lives already lived." The figures reacted visibly, leaning forward with obvious interest. There was another period of silence as they considered. Robert realized the magnitude of the sacrifice Greta was offering. That crystal clearly represented her entire inheritance, everything her family had preserved through the centuries. She was offering all of this for 2 children who weren't even hers. He started to protest, but Greta made a quick gesture with her hand for silence. The central figure finally spoke. "The dreamstone is indeed valuable, but it is not enough for 2 souls. I could trade it for 1, perhaps, but 2 require more. The scales must balance perfectly, or the veil between worlds would tear, bringing chaos to both sides. Is there anything else you can offer?" Greta hesitated for the first time since they had entered this impossible place. When she spoke again, her voice was thick with an emotion she had kept controlled until then. "I offer my remaining years. I have perhaps a decade left in this world. I give these years willingly. I will end my journey here, and now if that is what is necessary to complete the exchange." Catherine screamed, unable to remain silent any longer. "No, you can't do this. You've given too much. You can't sacrifice your life." But Greta turned to her with a gentle, sad smile. "My life is complete, dear child. I have lived more years than most, seen wonders and horrors beyond common comprehension. But these girls, your daughters, have barely begun. They have decades of life ahead of them. Love to give and receive, joys to experience. What value is a decade of an already full life compared to this?" The figures consulted again, this time for a longer time. Robert and Catherine held each other, tears flowing freely now, torn between the desperate hope of recovering their daughters and the horror of the price being paid. Finally, the central figure gave his decision. "The offer is accepted. The dreamstone and the remaining years of Greta of the Eastern Mountains in exchange for the 2 young souls. The balance will be maintained. But there is one additional condition. The children who return will not be exactly as they were. They have crossed over and been touched by the other side. They will carry the marks of this experience for the rest of their lives. They can see things others cannot, hear whispers from faraway places. Dream dreams that are more than dreams. Do you accept this?" There was no hesitation in Robert's answer. "We accept whatever the change, whatever the mark. They will still be our daughters, and we will love them." The central figure nodded slowly. "Then so be it. The exchange is done. Wait here." The curtain of light began to solidify again, hiding the 7 figures from view. Greta staggered, and Robert caught her before she fell. The old woman seemed to have aged decades in seconds, her face even more wrinkled, her eyes losing the silvery glow they had once held. "It is done," she whispered. "The girls will come soon. Take them home, love them well, and always remember the price that was paid." Time in that impossible chamber seemed to follow no normal rules. Seconds stretched like hours, or perhaps they were hours passing like seconds. Robert and Catherine held Greta propped between them, feeling the old woman's life slowly drain away, like sand through open fingers. She didn't seem to be in pain, just tired, like someone finally allowing themselves to rest after a long journey. Her lips moved occasionally, murmuring words in languages the couple didn't understand, perhaps prayers, perhaps farewells to long-dead ancestors. The curtain of light began to pulse with increasing intensity, glowing in hues that oscillated between gold and silver. The air in the chamber became charged with static electricity, making Robert and Catherine's hair stand on end. And then, through that luminous curtain, two small figures began to emerge. They walked slowly as if wading through thick water, their forms initially blurry and indefinite, gradually gaining solidity and clarity. When they finally crossed completely, Robert and Catherine saw their daughters for the first time in days that seemed like years. Marianne and Elizabeth stood before them, wearing the same simple clothes they had worn the day they disappeared, though strangely clean and without any sign of wear. Their expressions were serene, almost dreamy, like children waking from a deep, pleasant sleep. When their eyes finally focused on their parents, something in them changed, a recognition that brought tears and smiles simultaneously. Catherine released Greta, unable to resist a second longer, and ran to her daughters, falling to her knees and wrapping them in a desperate embrace. Robert followed immediately, his large, calloused hands touching the girls' faces as if needing confirmation that they were real, not illusions or ghosts. The girls were crying too, but they were strange tears, as if they were remembering emotions they had temporarily forgotten, rediscovering what it meant to feel human love and familial connection. Marianne was the first to speak, her voice soft but carrying a different quality, deeper somehow. "Daddy, Mommy, we saw things, places so beautiful there are no words. But we miss home, we miss you." Elizabeth, younger and always shy, only snuggled deeper into her mother's embrace, clutching Catherine's dress tightly, as if afraid of being taken again. Greta, still leaning against one of the impossible columns, spoke weakly but urgently. "You must leave now. Take the girls and leave while the passage is still open. I will stay here. It's part of the deal. Don't be afraid for me. This place is just a door, and I will simply pass through to another room in the great house of existence." Robert approached her gently, holding her wrinkled hand. "There are no words to thank you for what you did for us. We will never forget. We will never let our daughters forget. Your name will be honored in our family for all generations." The old woman smiled, and for a brief moment, her face looked young again, revealing the woman she had been decades ago. "Go now. The green light of the torch will guide you back. Follow it without straying, and you will emerge in the forest before dawn. Tell your children to wait in the cabin, that I have left a will under the third floorboard near the fireplace. Everything I have, including the knowledge I have accumulated, I leave to your family. Use it wisely. Protect these mountains. Respect the sacred places. And live well, live fully, for life is the most precious gift there is." Catherine kissed Greta's forehead, letting her tears wet the old woman's face. Robert bowed respectfully, a gesture he had never made to any human being in his life. Then, holding their daughters tightly, each with a free hand to hold a child, they took the green torch that still burned steadily and began walking back through the impossible tunnels. The return journey was easier than the outward one. The torch seemed to know the way, its flames slanting in specific directions, guiding them through passages that now seemed more normal, less distorted. The girls walked between their parents, occasionally glancing back as if they could see things Robert and Catherine could not. At one point, Elizabeth whispered that she could see Greta behind them. Not the old Greta, but a young Greta, smiling and waving. Catherine told her daughter to wave back, to say a proper goodbye to this extraordinary woman who had given everything to bring them home. When they finally emerged from the circular cave, the sky was beginning to lighten on the horizon. The night had passed, though to them it seemed they had only been in this impossible place for a few hours. The surrounding forest was waking with the sounds of morning birds, the normal world returning with all its simple, comforting beauty. Robert extinguished the green torch with damp earth, a gesture of respect for the object that had guided them safely. The walk back to Greta's cabin took less time than the journey there, as if the mountain were helping them return, bridging the gaps through means they couldn't comprehend. When they finally spotted the cabin through the trees, they saw James, Samuel, and David waiting anxiously outside. The moment the three young men saw their sisters was one of pure joy. Screams of happiness echoing across the mountains as they ran to embrace the girls. But the joy was tempered by the news of Greta's death. Robert told his children everything that had happened, the sacrifice the old woman had made. They found the will exactly where she said it would be, under the third floorboard. It was a document written in elaborate calligraphy, leaving her entire estate, including the cabin and surrounding land, along with dozens of journals filled with knowledge about herbs, sacred places in the mountains, and the ancient traditions she had preserved. Along with the journals was a hand-drawn map showing the locations of special places throughout the mountains, places that were to be protected and respected. The Pritchard family buried Greta's personal belongings in a beautiful spot behind the cabin beneath an ancient oak tree where wild flowers grew abundantly. There was no body to bury, but they created a memorial, a pile of carefully arranged stones with a simple wooden plaque on which Robert carved Greta of the Eastern Mountains, keeper of ancient wisdom, savior of lost children, 1883 to 1859. Her light lives on through those she touched. In the days and weeks that followed, life slowly returned to something resembling normal for the family. Marianne and Elizabeth reintegrated into the farm routine, helping with the daily chores, playing with their siblings, being children again. But there were changes, small but undeniable. They both had occasional nightmares, waking up speaking in languages no one recognized. Sometimes they would look into empty corners of the house and smile, as if seeing invisible visitors. And on certain nights, especially when the moon was hidden, they would go out into the yard and gaze at the mountains, as if hearing calls only they could hear. Judge Caldwell, when he finally heard the full story, decided to officially record the case as solved, though his records were deliberately vague about the details. He wrote that the Pritchard girls had become lost in the mountains, were sheltered by a kindly hermit named Greta, and eventually returned safely to their family. The deeper, stranger truth he kept in private records, documents he kept locked away, destined perhaps to be discovered by future generations who might be better equipped to understand them. Other families in the region began sharing their own stories more openly after the Pritchard girls returned. Tales of strange encounters in the mountains, of places where compasses spun wildly, of nights when the stars seemed to be in the wrong positions, of music heard coming from places where no one should be. A tacit understanding developed among the residents of those mountains. There were things beyond human comprehension living in the folds between the visible and invisible worlds. And wisdom lay in respecting this, in keeping one's distance from sacred places, in not disturbing the delicate balance that kept the worlds apart. Robert kept Greta's journals safe, studying them through the long winter nights. He learned about plants that could cure illnesses conventional doctors couldn't treat. He discovered the locations of springs with especially pure waters. He found instructions on how to identify and avoid dangerous places, those where the veil was particularly thin and accidental crossings could occur, and he carefully shared this knowledge with his children, ensuring that Greta's wisdom would continue to benefit his family and community. Catherine, in turn, taught her daughters about gratitude and sacrifice. She repeatedly told them Greta's story, ensuring that Marianne and Elizabeth understood the price that had been paid for their lives. The girls grew up with a deep sense of purpose, feeling they should live meaningful lives, honoring the sacrifice of this extraordinary woman. And indeed, in the years to come, both would become respected healers, using the knowledge from Greta's journals to help their communities, connecting ancient wisdom with the emerging modern world. The Appalachian Mountains kept their secrets, as they always had, as they always would. The circular clearing was eventually reclaimed by the forest, young trees growing where once there had been only open space. The cave with the luminous lake remained hidden, known only to the Pritchard family and a few others who had been chosen to visit. And on moonless nights, when the veil between worlds grew thin, those sensitive enough could still hear ancient songs floating through the mountains, echoes of times when humanity understood that the visible world was but a thin layer over vast and mysterious depths. The story of the Pritchard family and Greta of the Eastern Highlands' sacrifice would be told and retold through generations, each time losing some details and gaining others, slowly transforming from historical event to local legend. But those who actually lived through those October days of 1859 never forgot the complete truth. They carried with them until their final days the absolute certainty that the universe was vaster, stranger, and more wonderful than any philosophy or science could fully explain. And so ends this journey through one of the darkest and most inexplicable chapters in Appalachian history. A mystery that has been partially solved, but left behind more questions than answers. Because perhaps that's exactly what great mysteries are supposed to do. Not give us all the answers, but remind us that there are still wonders in the world. There are still places where the inexplicable touches everyday life. There are still reasons to look upon the shadows of the mountains with awe and wonder. If this story touched you in any way, if it made you question what else might exist beyond the boundaries of common understanding, leave your mark here. Subscribe to this channel for more journeys through the forgotten mysteries of history. Leave a comment letting us know if you know of a similar story from your own region, or simply share your thoughts on what you just heard. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be preserved and shared, hit the like button. Every gesture helps keep alive the tradition of telling stories that challenge our understanding of the world. Thank you for joining me on this journey deep into the Appalachian Mountains. Until our next story, keep your eyes open to the mysteries that surround us, because the inexplicable is closer than we imagine.